It's not just robust, it's not just resilient, but we will be stronger on the other side of adversity. And so we went into the pandemic expecting to come out a more robust institution. If you went into the pandemic thinking you'd weather the storm, but that it was a storm and it would pass, and that it probably wouldn't be, I mean, I had colleagues that thought, I'm curious what you thought, Chris, but I had colleagues that thought this was like, well, we'll be home for 3 weeks, it's a long spring break. And this was a hell of a long spring break.
If you were prepared, you were in great shape. But most universities just didn't have access to a robust technology stack for online learning. They didn't have access to a great ed tech or teaching and learning center team that could do this. The folks that did, let me just say, they were real heroes, working tirelessly around the clock to do what was an unthinkable lift only a day before they had started.
Education professionals Donna Kidwell and Christopher Rice join John and Scoop on the Plutopia podcast. We discuss how colleges and universities responded to COVID-19, remote learning, surveillance capitalism, and much more.
Hey, welcome everybody to another Plutopia podcast. Our guests today are Christopher Rice and Donna Kidwell, and we're going to talk about the future of higher education. Christopher Rice is the founder and managing partner of Refuturing, where he leads foresight, strategy, and research activities. As a futurist, ethnographer, experience designer, educator, and political theorist, his work over the last 20-plus years has explored the intersections of society, technology, economics, and the environment and politics. Definitely a Plutopian. Donna Kidwell is Chief Information Security and Digital Trust Officer at Arizona State University. She was formerly Chief Technology Officer for Ed Plus, where she led a diverse IT portfolio and a team centered around digitally serving learners everywhere. And Donna, I've known futurists who have gone to the University of Arizona and done some kind of interesting projects there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering are you dipping into those?
Of course. Like, how could you not? We have a Center for Science and the Imagination that regularly publishes like really cool speculative science discussions. So yeah, it's great to be on a campus that just really thrives on that conversation.
So we were going to talk about the future of higher education, and one of the first things and one of the most obvious things to talk about is how COVID-19 is changing higher education. Do either of you think we'll ever go back to normal?
Well.
Whatever normal is.
That's
I think
right.
I know there was already a lot of evolution in higher education before this ever hit.
Not as much as we needed, but.
So is this making a positive difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to come back to your normal. I think we're going to redefine normal, and it's going to be super uncomfortable, depending on where you're coming from and your attitudes towards how tightly that normal meant something to you. I think we have a faculty member here at ASU. Her name is Liz Lehrman. And she does this really beautiful, she's a choreographer. So her work is really dance. She does amazing design work. And she has a concept called Mourning the Loss. And I think there'll be a lot of that in this next year as we're transitioning and figuring out what the new normal looks like. Like, we on the campus will take these appreciative moments to say, that was awesome, we're gonna let it go. Or maybe we didn't think that was awesome, we're gonna let it go. And try to do that with a little bit of compassion. But I don't know, Chris, you want to catch on that one? And then we'll take John second.
So you know me, I tend to be a little bit more on the pessimistic side of this.
Dr.
Donna
Rice?
has I know it's my reputation precedes me, but Donna has the great fortune at being one of the most innovative universities in the world right now. And ASU is going to come out of this situation even stronger and more innovative than when they went in. And that's amazing. I mean, that's a tremendous compliment to Donna and her team and Lev and his team and what President Crow and others have done. other universities are going to stampede the doors to try to get back to something approximating normal as quickly as possible, right? I just got an update from my son's university this morning that indicated exactly that here in Texas. And so I think universities that were prepared before this came and we're already making movements in transforming curriculum, transforming the online environment, I think they're going to come out of this great. Other universities that got caught on their heels a bit and worked valiantly to better serve their students and their communities, I think they're going to take a huge hit from this, and they're going to want to try to get back to something as close to pre-COVID normal as possible, as quickly as possible.
What are some of the mistakes you've seen people making, or unfortunate moves, I guess I would say, in trying to manage through COVID?
I think part of it is the assumption as it hit, which for us was exactly a year ago. It was this week, last year, when announcements went out saying this is real, and the campus is responding immediately. Go home if you can. And of course, we had thousands of students that couldn't. So all of that happened exactly a year ago. I got a voice message from President Crow, and at the end, he made an aliens reference. He told us all to stay frosty. But that was the mindset going in, that this was a new kind of invader. And he uses, like, his last Board of Regents presentation had a slide that used the word anti-fragile. He means it, that it's not just robust, it's not just resilient, that we will be stronger on the other side of adversity. And so we went into the pandemic expecting to come out a more robust institution. If you went into the pandemic thinking you'd weather the storm, but that it was a storm and it would pass, and that it probably wouldn't be, I mean, I had colleagues that thought, I'm curious what you thought, Chris, but I had colleagues that thought this was like, well, we'll be home for 3 weeks. It's a long spring break. And this was a hell of a long spring break.
Yeah.
If that's what you thought going in. And so if that was your mindset, if you were reacting under the expectation that normal was right around the corner, and that corner was May, that corner was July, that corner was August, that corner was November, oh, holidays, that surely it's going to be by spring semester, then I think that was at least the start of then the other kinds of responses that were not so great.
Yeah, I'll agree with Donna. I mean, if you were prepared, you were in great shape. But most universities just didn't have access to a robust technology stack for online learning. They didn't have access to a great ed tech or teaching and learning center team that could do this. The folks that did, let me just say, they were real heroes, working tirelessly around the clock to do what was an unthinkable lift only a day before they had started. And so, but I'll also agree with Donna. A lot of folks that I was talking to at the time thought, we'll do this lift, we'll survive the spring, summer, we'll just clear this out, and by fall, we'll be back to normal. And I saw people putting off decisions. And as a foresight strategist, I'm pushing, clients and friends, think ahead for the future. Let's anticipate what happens if this doesn't all end by the summer. And that was just hard. People just didn't have the emotional or mental bandwidth by May to do it. And then by the end of July, beginning of August, when reality began to set in, things began to get tough.
Well, and the campuses delayed the decisions, right? They said, I don't know, maybe the heat's going to burn it off, and you don't have flus in the summer. It's going to be fine by the time the kids need to come back in the fall. And if you were a student, so like if you think of the tempo, the regular cadence on a campus, freshmen making their decision, many of them would have made their decision or were right on the crux inside of that March and April, May, to decide where they'd go in the fall. And so then you had all these like enrollment and admissions folks thinking, like, are the students committed going to show up in the fall? And the students thinking, is it going to be safe for me to leave home? So in the midst of all of that, families trying to make their decisions, learners trying to make their decisions, administrators trying to make their decisions, faculty trying to plan their falls. Like everybody was kind of paralyzed. I remember a lot of, trying to push that decision in little micro increments, like almost like an agile sprint. Like, can we do it in the next 2 weeks and not try to make the decision now? Not necessarily at ASU, because our mindset was we're going to roll with every punch. And we effectively announced that we were never going to close. We were just going to adapt, which also got its own form of exhaustion and its own form of heroics. But as Chris says, for almost everybody else, if you were postponing that decision, then big technology challenges, restructuring a class that you need to teach over the next 13 weeks, and that's postponing those decisions was brutal.
How would you characterize students' COVID protocol attitudes today versus when it first started? Has there been a sea change, or has it been better? Has it been worse?
Y'all are in Texas.
That's that's a really tough question. I mean, young people are young people, right? And I think universities made the best of plans with the assumptions that young people would act 10 years older than their actual age. And of course, in Texas, you have to multiply by that Texas factor too. So
I'm in Arizona. We're not that much better.
Yeah, I don't think at first it did. I mean, we saw reports from across the country of parties going on. And this was different university to university. So you look at San Diego State University, part of the Cal State system, they had a tremendous outbreak early on, extensive social culture at that university. Whereas University of California, San Diego implemented a massively draconian testing regime. The students are sort of legendary for not being as social, being more academically focused, and they have avoided any sort of outbreak. So it really depends on the culture of the university that was in place before COVID started.
But I know to a pretty great extent, they were like holding remote classes, a lot of them using Zoom. And it seems to me that one of the issues with that was the reliability of bandwidth on the student's side, really. I mean, you can control the bandwidth on the university side, but you can't control what the student's access is going to be if they're just kind of logging in from their home. So it seems like that probably created a lot of like variability in participation, right?
John, do you remember all those digital divide events in the 90s that we were doing?
I was thinking about that a lot. I was thinking, this is like classic community networking stuff,
Totally.
I mean, it was like we were trying to figure out how to get the bandwidth to elementary and junior high and high school students, and now you've got to worry about college students. And if they don't have the bandwidth, they can't really participate.
No, you're absolutely right. And just like in the 90s, libraries came to the win. The difference being now that also Starbucks and McDonald's came in for the win to try to help out those students. That's that's a piece that I'm really curious about, to see how we respond. The reality of a digital divide, of what that means in a current context, how many assumptions we may have had that we solved that problem 20 or 30 years ago, and being so faced with how poorly we really were positioned for that. I'm really curious to see how we all respond.
Even the best resourced universities, I'm working with a client now where they did, let me just say, incredibly impressive, rapid, and expensive work over the summer to overhaul their residential Wi-Fi capacity. And it still doesn't look like it was quite enough, right? And some of that is technology, but the interesting thing that I've found in some recent interviews that I've done is that when faculty are trying to do the right thing pedagogically, more group work, more collaborative work, less high stakes assessment in the presence of unreliable Wi-Fi, the students are in an incredible bind, because then they're all consuming a lot of bandwidth synchronously. They can't be together physically. They're doing their best to do the right thing pedagogically, both students and faculty, but it's just really hard right now, even for the best prepared universities.
Were the faculty still able to have things like office hours, individual meetings with students to as great an extent as they could when it was face to face?
I think so. And we all moved to Zoom. Um, I think the piece that was a real challenge for the campuses that have coursework that really depends on labs is that you couldn't do the laboratory experience the same way. If you were like our vocal performance programs really struggled in the fall because vocalization, something that puts your voice and your breath out there, and there's not a safe way to handle that. So they had, mobile music facilities that they were working with. A lot of innovation comes with that, but your mileage may vary as to how easy it was for your discipline to manage in a remote modality.
The whole issue of bandwidth availability is better in the metropolitan areas, but in more rural areas, colleges, junior colleges that are not near a metropolitan area have had serious problems. Many just couldn't cope. Do you see?
This is one of the things I am most excited to learn about after we get done with this. And my thought is that I think we're going to see some really incredible innovations if we care to ask from our rural universities. So Don, I was thinking about the work that we've done with RGB while we were at UT System.
Great example.
Right? Like they've already kind of thought ahead of this because they've had to, right? And I think about institutions I used to work with in Appalachia, right? To some extent, they've already had to think about how one handles a low bandwidth environment. So rather than thinking, gosh, it must have been awful, these are incredibly ingenious folks that are already doing amazing work under difficult circumstances. And I think we're going to have a lot to learn. Sorry, Donna, I cut you off there.
No, I lost my audio for a bit. It wasn't you. As technology. No, and I think that's like I said, I'm just really curious to see how we respond to it. Just maybe 2 weeks ago, we had Larry Irvine come and talk to our technology group specifically about this and to try to get, I don't know, let's say 500 technologists across ASU to have that opportunity to hear what work Larry was doing with the digital divide in the 90s and what he sees the call to be now, and to give us, and by us, every level of technologists, whether they're working desk side or they're working, handling what's in the server rooms, or whether they're, learning technologists directly working with faculty on tackling these pedagogies. Like that whole group was then charged with, okay, what do we need to do as a university to solve the digital divide? And Larry was, I think a wonderful voice for them to hear. But it's also, especially if you're a younger technologist on a campus, not like us with our good old 90s recollections, or before that. But if you're a young, late 20s something, let's say early 30s something on the campus, I don't think they realize how long we've been fighting these battles. And so they don't have the same set of frustrations that we do, that the battles still have to be fought. So having someone like that who's been decades trying to move the meter, I think is an important thing. Our technologists on the campus communities across the board need to hear that this is a war we've been raging for a long time, and that clearly we haven't won yet.
Well, I think some assume that we have won it, or we're assuming that we had won it. It was not as prominent an issue. And I know people I knew before that were involved in community networking movements seem to be less vocal and less present over the last few years, because everybody's got their smartphone in their pocket and they've got broadband access, but really that's not everybody, right? There's still a lot of people who don't have that kind of access, and especially in rural communities.
Yeah, and these are, you're talking about pretty heavy Zoom usage. if you took classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays and had lined those all up, that student's on a Zoom, or a kid at home homeschooling, right? For what would have normally been a school day. That's a tremendous amount of usage on devices that weren't form factors that were really designed for that particular case. So even the ones that, and Scoop, to your point, even the ones that were in more urban environments doesn't mean that they really had the access that they needed to be successful, or the support structures around them to be successful. Lots of lessons learned.
Yeah, I mean, one of my big concerns early on was that knowing that you had not only college students at home, they might be at home with a faculty member, their younger siblings are doing courses online, a spouse is working from home. And then you look at all the homes up and down your street, and all of a sudden you think, how much is that bandwidth going to dip during the course of the day? So even people who were previously in urban areas that were rich in bandwidth, all of a sudden things slowed to a trickle in some cases.
Yeah, it's like living in a house with a gamer. Suddenly you have no bandwidth left.
But there might be 4 of them.
And that's
because
about
the parents and
equivalent.
everybody, right?
And gamers all along the block, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm kind of not up to date on this, but I would think I have been in contact with some people who they're network people, and they're still talking about this, and they've been really concerned about, among other things, kind of what's happening at the FCC and whether the FCC is really attending to this problem. And apparently it hadn't been very well over the last few years under the latest regime, I guess. So hopefully this will become another significant issue for the FCC.
I hope so, John. I mean, it's one of those things that COVID and our response didn't cause these things. They just brought to the surface in a really rapid manner the problems that were already there and made them visible. So hopefully this will give us the fortitude to begin dealing.
So speaking of problems that were surfaced in the last few years, there's other big issues we've been hearing about, specifically systemic racism and surveillance capitalism are both kind of big issues, and they have become more prominent recently. I know there's been a lot of debate about surveillance capitalism, which is like the various platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so forth kind of making money by sucking up your data and figuring out how to serve you ads and that sort of thing. And then also the problem of racism, which I think a lot of people thought that racism was over in this country, and suddenly it appears to be like a huge problem. And it wasn't over after all. It was just kind of buried, right? So how are these impacting campuses especially?
Oh man, where do we start, Chris?
I'll start so much.
Yeah, we'll take surveillance capitalism. We'll start there. In one way, one of the reasons, there are a lot of reasons I like being at ASU, and thanks for the kind words earlier, Chris, but one of the things is that our president regularly tells his leadership that if higher ed is broken, if we've got challenges with the model, the universities are complicit in that problem. Like, we've been here the whole time. Most of us are institutions. ASU is not, University of Texas Austin isn't, although it might surprise you, they're not the land grant schools of their states. But the land grant colleges, the universities like UT and ASU, we're certainly part of the fabric of creating this reality that we're in. And if we look at the big players for surveillance capitalism, let's just say, I don't know, Facebook, Zuckerberg kind of went to an Ivy League and he did exactly what we expect, right? At UT Austin, they'd say what starts here changes the world. Like, you get a young, bright, ambitious, entrepreneurial, engineering mindset, throw them into the right ecosystem. Maybe they're also, a white guy. Give them something fun to chew on, and then maybe if they play all the entrepreneurial cards right, then they hit that creating a market. They hit that creating a market in a way that also gives American dominance. I spent a lot of time in Norway, so I get lots of insight from my colleagues there about the role that we play in that technology space. But that's exactly like that's the path everybody would have hoped for. So let's say another player in that surveillance capitalist state. Well, there's Google, and that is tech transferred directly out of Stanford, absolutely directly out of Stanford. One of the prize stories of technology being transferred out of the university. So one, we have an entrepreneurial path that's not necessarily tech transfer. And then you have another one that is absolutely tech transfer. I think universities are 100% part of this game, and how we as a university think about our role towards entrepreneurship, our role towards innovation, our role towards market shaping, our role and how we work with policymakers, because frankly, most of the policymakers are being educated at our universities. They're coming out of our law schools. Like, we absolutely have a voice in how we would take that and think about it differently, how we'd ask for different models, how we would try to ask those hard questions, poise the really hard experiments, and then hopefully have as much impact with maybe more intended consequences than the set that we've got now, which is largely technology, driven by innovation imperatives and mandates, but not an innovation mandate, but not necessarily an understanding of the consequences it would drive.
It occurs to me that the seeds of what we were calling surveillance capitalism precede it by quite a bit. I mean, you go back to the various models that we've had for media in general.
Great point.
Tends to be advertising based. Advertising subsidizes it, and advertisers try to learn as much as they can about the people that are buying their products and try to figure out how to get in front of the people who will buy their products. It totally makes sense what's happened here. And meanwhile, we have the tradition in the internet of kind of having everything be free. So the expectation was that when you go to Facebook, when you go to Twitter, whatever, it's going to be free for you to use. But that means as it evolved that you became the product, that the guys at Facebook or Twitter or whatever other platform were selling your eyeballs to advertisers. And that seemed kind of inevitable. So if you're like teaching people to have an entrepreneurial spirit, they have to figure out what their business model is going to be. And this is the business model we kind of handed them, right?
And let me say, universities are super susceptible to this. As I was describing to a friend the other day, when it comes to tech, higher ed has been like one of those folks that hangs around the grocery store all day, living off of free samples as a lifestyle. And that's higher ed, right? In a nutshell. And because of that price sensitivity, higher ed opens itself up to all sorts of things that go on, because to price as a vendor, to price into something that's sustainable in the higher ed market, you're thinking about data plays on the back end. Do you have Google Analytics installed on your web-based service that's scraping out that data that maybe you didn't think to put something about that into your contract with that vendor, and they're making a little money on the side from that? Perfectly legal, not so good for students or institutions. And at an even broader plumbing level, most of the higher ed tech stack is living on AWS. You think you're dealing with the vendor, but at the root, it's all AWS. So we build it, the price point incentivizes it, especially in higher ed, but our own behavior tends to do that. And look, as Donna has said earlier, we're complicit in a lot of this ourselves, right? We've bought into massive work on analytics, where we're collecting more data points than ever on students. They're not aware of it. And I often wonder if, as universities, if we had one of these Apple-style privacy pop-ups that says, hey, the university has observed what you've had to eat or when you went to the library 3 times in the last day. Are you cool with that? I often wonder how would that change our behavior, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. I stepped into this chief digital trust role about 3 months ago, and just to ask these kinds of questions, and just to think, and Chris, you and I might have been in the room the first time I heard data exhaust used as a term for what was effectively, or at least hopefully, learning analytics. But if you think of that data as exhaust, then it has no value. So what's in fact, the right thing to do, right, would be to turn that on its ear and make it not something that's just data pollution, but make it something useful. That's a good thing, right? So it's that whole mindset of what data we're collecting, why we're collecting it, who has transparency into why we're collecting it, how long, every university's got retention policies, usually for legal regulatory reasons, as to how long they keep data. That's a whole different thing than intentionally thinking about what relationship you want with a learner, and then what that promise is, what the commitment is to them, and how you would want to share with them. I think we try to experiment on learners as opposed to experimenting with them. And we are universities, yes. We should be in this together, figuring those out right alongside them.
One of the things I've read a lot recently, and it sort of relates to surveillance, but it's actually to the analytics around remote learning by students. And there have been a huge increase in the number of failing students, especially in the metropolitan areas. And it's students that are learning remotely. What is your feeling about this situation? Can that be improved, or is it just another point to make to send everybody back into the classroom?
That's a tough one. I think what I hope is that it makes us realize the very real divides that are sitting in our classrooms today that aren't necessarily as visible because the university's resources in place are smoothing that out, right? Not all of us go home to the same safe spaces at home. Not everybody has enough food on the shelf. Not everybody has a relatively noise-free environment. Maybe you're back home sharing a room with a sibling and you're asked to have your camera on during Zoom, or you've got that proctoring software going and you're having to desperately rearrange a small household to do it, right? I mean, the university smooths a lot of that out and creates an appearance of equality, but really what COVID has done is just expose stuff that's there all along. We just haven't paid attention enough to it.
Which isn't a bad segue into the second part of your incredibly hard to answer question, John, around systemic racism. Like that's, we basically had a couple different major discussions, opportunities maybe, whether it's the pandemic or our political situation in 2020, that ripped away a lot of things that, just as Chris pointed out, kind of gave us a sense that everything was okay, and now you couldn't avoid that it wasn't okay. And lots of repetitive, every hour there was a new thing that you could then take and say, okay, well, here's a challenge, and bam, we got that wrong again, or we're still really angry about this thing, and I'm angry about it in this way. At the same time, I'm angry about it in that way, and give it another 6 hours and there'll be another thing on Twitter that'll show you another way I'm pissed about it. That kind of dialogue, was, I think, in some ways it created a chance to have some incredibly brave conversations with people to kind of unpack and say, hey, what is it about that image that made you respond that way? Or what is it about the Eyes of Texas that you're really, really wanting to hear when the band doesn't want to play it and we're losing players to Oklahoma? What is it that, and those opportunities to unpack the conversation we had lots and lots and lots and lots of them. So if you thought that in June or July, this was just going to pass, they kept coming in lots of different forms across lots of different parts of our lives. So in that respect, I think it's given us a tremendous wealth of opportunity to reframe the conversation and to maybe understand how deep the problem was. Because for those of us that I think were sitting there thinking, what is happening and how do we try to respond to it, and how do we try to get some meaningful conversations happening between, say, summer when here in Phoenix, I live downtown, and the protests were every night, helicopters every night, tear gas that I could smell from my backyard. It was very real. So as you're comparing that to an election coming up and conversations that you want to really have become meaningful and maybe make progress in a short order, I think that's pretty extraordinary opportunity.
You know, it's tempting to say that having apparent racist signals coming from leaders maybe inspired some kind of like devolution into or maybe just catalyzed a more vocal set of racist elements, I guess you would say. But I think part of what's happened is that now everybody's got a camera in their pocket and they can shoot video. So when there's an instance of racism, you know, whether it's like George Floyd or whether it's some quote Karen going after somebody who's you know, walking while black, we've just had a slew of these things start cropping up, and it's because it was so easy to capture those moments and expose them. So the question is, what have we really continued to be a racist society all along, but it was just hidden, you know, and we were kind of patting ourselves on the back and congratulating ourselves for having overcome racism because it appeared that maybe we had, but really it hadn't gone anywhere. It was just still happening.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It never went away. Being a lifelong Southerner myself, you know, it never went away. It maybe got brushed under a carpet or was talked about more politely, but it never went away. And so I think the environmental signals just flared this thing up, which is both horrifying, but also it allows us to not be comfortable with the idea that we had eliminated it. Now it's out in the open. Now we have to do the hard work. Now we have to have the conversations. And I think we just have to step up to that challenge. And I think the idea that everyone has a camera, I was thinking, you know, my friend Jimé Cascio at Institute for the Future, you know, Jimé has that term surveillance that he talked about, what was it, like 15 years ago? Like, what happens when we all have cameras? What does that culture look like? And I was thinking, you know, it's not only in our hands, but the Ring cameras that we install up and down the street everywhere, what that does to young men who are now constantly surveilled without even being aware of the act of active surveillance, and what does that do to us?
Yeah, Jimé, who's also a friend of mine, had a term, participatory panopticon.
Yes,
to describe that thing, that very thing.
Well, and while you're capturing real, whether or not you're comfortable with real, at the same time, you've got a greater understanding and facility of the unreal, right? So we've got incredibly capable deepfakes, and we've got augmented reality on Snapchat that makes you look, I don't know, like a turtle or a rabbit or a cat if you're a judge. You know, it's pretty crazy that at the same time that we're getting far, far better reality and in a sense of the complexity and the actual ugly truth of that reality, we've also gotten better and better and better at forging it.
Donna, that poor attorney with that filter break he had. I knew we had hit a turning point when he had to say to the judge, I'm real, I'm not a cat, and I'm here. The fact that we're in a digital environment where now we have to attest to those things rather than being blatantly obvious. I mean, thinking about that Tom Cruise deep fake, right? Like, you know, how easy it is to feel that we have to make very clear, blatant epistemological assertions about reality, whereas before we didn't, I think is a real turning point for us. And that cat bit is going to stick with us for a while, I think.
So I'm going to bring up an issue related to racism, among other things, and also related to higher education in a big way, and that's cancel culture. This idea that there's a cancel culture, and that especially on universities, they talk about this a lot, about how universities are being very politically correct and are canceling people or trying to eliminate the possibility that a person can speak or have a voice. What impact is that? Is that really as big a thing as some people seem to think it is? And how is higher education in general addressing that?
These are really tough questions for a Friday afternoon.
I love tough questions.
That's a tough one. I mean,
unless I have to answer them.
I mean, unless we get to roll into happy hour at some point. Come on, John.
I think Merrick Garland's answer to this the other day was sort of spot on, where our own Senator Cruz, tried to ask him if he would do anything about cancel culture, and Merrick Garland just had to respond, I really don't even know what that is. Is that a thing? And I think it is, the culture wars is just such a messy thing. And I don't know if the left has quite gotten as good at fighting that as the right. So I worry when people get pulled into it. I mean, obviously on the right, cancel culture is just what we call being PC now, right? I mean, it's the same thing in a different linguistic framework, but it's the same thing. Is it that big a deal on universities? I don't think so. It's just a continuation of that rhetoric that your socialist professors were trying to, indoctrinate you, which was never the case. But it's the same. It's old wine in a new skin, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, I have to agree. I don't know that the campus experience or university experience of it is any worse than we're seeing anyplace else. It's the same conversation. But I do think that our language is really powerful and that nobody wants to be canceled. I mean, that's what happens after, Fonz jumps a shark or something. Nobody wants that. So it's very insidious language. And I think so much of this oversimplifies what we're actually trying to have conversations about, and then becomes this kind of immediate neutralization button, and trying to figure out how to engage appropriately in the places where it happens the worst, which is largely social media, and that's where it's just either an echo chamber of discussion around it, or one little voice that's trying to, that one cousin who insists on trying to interject there something that sounds like a little different from the rest of the conversation. It's a constant battle.
I think there's a bit of confusion. A lot of this I see coming from the right, but terms like banning and censorship and canceling, it's like if the government burns all of my books, I think that they're banning my book. If a publisher decides not to publish my book, that's not banning my book. If an editor decides not to publish my letter to the editor, they're not censoring me. That's not censorship. It's their choice. And I think people are confused about, they're like kind of giving more weight to decisions that are perfectly reasonable decisions, really giving more weight to them as some kind of egregious problem. They were talking about how Dr. Seuss's books were being banned because the publisher decided to quit publishing them because they had some racially difficult bits, And it's like, no, they didn't ban the books. They don't have to publish them. You can't force them to publish the books.
Yeah, there are some elements of our society that are all about the free market right up until they aren't.
But that's a big part of it, right?
Right.
Arizona and Texas are both states that are pretty proud of our rugged individualism, and the sense of liberty that comes with that rugged individualism. And somehow that then extends towards mask mandates. Like the logic gets really, really tied up without a deeper, like even the whole mask discussions now, because your governor, and I hope your governor doesn't give my governor any ideas, but I'm sure they hang out together.
They probably have similar ideas, I think.
they probably do. But we haven't made this this mask discussion yet. We did just open schools. But the idea that somehow wearing a mask is, what's the term? Virtue signaling. Like, that's crazy twist of logic. It really is a crazy twist. I think it's a little crazy. I find it hard to empathize with where you come from when you decide that wearing a mask, which, you know, most people, at least I think, have a sense that they are protecting others. We took a while to socialize that message, right? That the mask was not about protecting yourself as much as it was that you might be carrying it and not know. And if you're asymptomatic, then you're protecting others by wearing it. That is not in its soul a selfish thing to do. It's not I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Donna. I mean, the issue of virtue signaling is super complex, right? And multi-sided. I mean, one of the things that really worries me in that regard about the whole cancel culture bit is its close relative clicktivism, right? I mean, I worry that there are a lot of young people on our campuses who are engaged in a form of therapeutic politics, that they feel that you can get on, activate a hashtag, really burn somebody who's done something probably justifiably stupid or wrong, right? But does that then create that sense that now you don't have to go out and do the hard policy work, the hard organizing to deal with issues of systemic racism, of police violence? I've done my part. I've done hashtag warfare, and now I don't actually have to learn about how to make good policy that's going to fix some issues. That concerns me a lot about our students on campus these days.
Well, I'd like to throw you a question about the business of higher education. There's been an increase over the years of the for-profit colleges and universities.
Oh, yeah.
Trump University was the poster child for this kind of business, and there have been good actors and bad actors in the space. But what's the real impact of these new players on higher education? Can it continue in this trend, or will there need to be regulation?
Donna,
Come on,
I'm going to
Chris.
throw this one over to you first.
Come on, Chris. I know you've got opinions on it. There has been regulation on the for-profits. My family was in for-profit. My father was during the Obama administration. And I remember what I thought were frankly really healthy conversations around a for-profits requirement to demonstrate job security for the students as they graduated. Whereas universities, we've never been asked to demonstrate that you can get a job when you graduate. Like that question, that challenge between a private sector and a public sector, or university and a for-profit, that tension, I think, is a healthy one, and forces us to ask some real questions that at its heart are about what is the value proposition of an education, what are the expectations and the promise being made by the institution and the learner when it does then come time for them to extract that value, which I might argue could happen not only through a job, but through beautiful creative works. So really thinking holistically, I think those questions are great. We then went into an administration where that conversation, I think, became a little bit Davos colored. And for the most part, stalemated in a lot of ways. A lot of the universities that I worked with internationally that were depending on some cash flow that would happen out of the Department of Education, all of those trains stopped. So we're in a really interesting place now, coming on the other side of that. The economics of higher education in the United States are undoubtedly complicated ones to try to work our ways out of. And colleagues of mine in Norway posted after the Super Bowl, Will Ferrell did that commercial, kind of challenging Norway. And so my Norwegian rector, that's the president of a university, did a response that was hilarious on YouTube. And in that, she's got an American student, and she's coaching the American student to say, we have to pay tuition. We have to pay tuition, which doesn't happen in Norway, but she's afraid that Will Ferrell is going to come and punch her in the face. So she's got to coach the students to say this. There are other models for doing it. We're deeply embedded in the one that we've got, at least on on ASU's perspective, our charter starts with, who has access and how they succeed. And so we work really hard to partner with industry. We don't really get appreciable money from the state coffers. No state university does anymore, really. So we've got to think very innovatively about how we rethink those financial models, but they are pretty stuck.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's business model innovation in higher ed is a tremendous challenge, right? And one of the first responses to that were for-profit institutions. Now, I'm a product of public institutions. My wife is a product of both a community college and went back in midlife to a private institution to get a culinary degree, because in our area, that's who offered that. And it was a great experience, right? But we have to recognize that, speaking of race issues, right? I mean, Tressie McMillan Cottom did that book, Lower Ed, that talks about some of the real racial disparities when it comes to debt and access, specifically around for-profit institutions. And I'd highly recommend anybody pick up that book to help think about the issue. But one trend we've seen in recent years is for-profit institutions basically selling themselves for $1 to reputable public institutions and trying desperately to get out of that for-profit status. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. If anything, that will accelerate. There might be a few players left, but look, even one of the biggest, Grand Canyon University, is currently going through that process of trying not to be a private institution. So I think that have been an evolutionary dead end when it comes to business model innovation in higher ed, and where we go from there. Oh, wow, that's a complex issue.
Those for-profits are, or not-for-profits that were formerly for-profits, and then during the Obama administration made that switch. That set of schools, when they do partner with prestigious universities, because those universities are trying to innovate on their business models and trying to figure out how to service learners different, we come up with another whole set of complexities in that the tier 1 research institution, I'm thinking University of Arizona and Purdue, these universities that have really, really strong underpinnings for their own learning experience already, you can't just bolt on somebody else's learning experience and their market segmentation, and the business models are designed, right? They serve somebody, and getting those two culturally to fix, pedagogically to fix, to actually be learning experiences that really have harmony for the individual who's trying to traverse them. That stuff is hard. And I do think that there's a bit of just not realizing how tough the journey is. Chris and I've had at least one adventure trying to figure out how do you do that. And it is not an easy thing to do. You've got to have extraordinary levels of commitment from faculty all the way through your administration to really be able to do it.
We're kind of down to the wire here, where we're almost out of time, and we haven't talked about climate change. So I just wanted to throw that out quickly. You might not be able to go into as much depth with this particular question, but how is climate change having an impact on higher education?
Wow. So I'll say that climate change is already having an impact. I mean, the university that I think of that was at ground zero for this really was Tulane when Katrina hit. And that was the first university that really had to get serious about thinking about what happens when your students are scattered all over the United States. Their records are incomplete. How do you make sure everyone has a record of what they've accomplished, and is that transferable? How do we manage that? How do we manage financial flows when now aid needs to suddenly go someplace very different than it went before? And our universities continue to deal with this and will do it. I mean, I think there was a map published recently where showing where sea level rise is going to happen over the next half century, and where all these universities are located along the coastline, specifically along the Atlantic coast. And a lot of them are going to be in some serious trouble and relatively soon. So how do we deal with climate migration and our students, whether from slow sea rise or from extreme weather conditions? That's a challenge. It's financial flows, records, a sense of mental and emotional security, continuity of learning and standards. It's a big challenge.
Overall instability, huh?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And knowing that we're almost at time, I might turn that a little bit and say, but it's also like our opportunity, right? We are public universities. We are dedicated towards massive problem solving in our communities. Being able to then pull together, whether it's students from public health and students from schools of sustainability, our engineering students, our business students, our law students, get all of them focused on what these challenges are and thinking, giving them real experiences during their time with us as universities to really chew on those so that then they can go become the agents that we need to fix this. I think, we're both part of suffering from what's happening to us and at the same time, one of our best sources of solutions.
Absolutely. And I'll say one thing that concerns me is, as a futurist looking at higher ed and how it deals with the environment, I don't think we're moving nearly quickly enough to educate students for the skills and the democratic practices that they're going to need to be able to get us through the next era of the Anthropocene. I worry a lot about that. Some universities, look, as crazy as it sounds, Texas Tech and Lubbock, right? They have a fantastic wind energy program. They're cranking out tons of graduates who are going to build us a clean energy future. You've got Catherine Hayhoe up there that is doing fantastic work in environmental studies. But we largely have what Jim Dater would call this continuation model of the future, that we're training students to be in a workforce that is going to be very much the same as it is today in 20 years. And we know, looking at the trend lines, that's not the case. So we have to get really innovative about co-curriculum that really does create those citizens of the future. And if we don't do that, I don't have a lot of optimism that we're going to make it.
Yeah, strategic foresight is very compelling right now. Well, thank you both for joining us today. I think we've run out of time. Maybe we can do this again and talk about... Yeah, we'll talk about more issues of the Anthropocene.
I feel smarter already.
Thanks, Scoop.
Thanks, Scoop.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, you guys go enjoy some wildflowers for me.
I'm going to go have a happy hour.
Oh, that too. Cheers, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.